All right, guys, we have gone through a ton of lessons at this point. You should probably have a pretty good idea of how to use your camera and how to use it in a number of different scenarios. But as I was teaching these lessons, I was really just focusing on how to work the camera, the meat and potatoes of how photography actually works, rather than trying to take really good looking pictures. So what we've done here is we have hired one of our longtime friends, an awesome model named Christy. She's worked with us for a long time in the past, and she has moved back to Charleston, and we're going to go out with her today and do a number of different shots, and I'm just going to kind of talk through my thought process as I'm taking these pictures. And I'm going to start from ground zero. We're going to be shooting in manual most of the time, and I'm going to tell you every single setting that I'm changing on the camera, why I'm changing it, and I'm going to show you those pictures as I'm working through it. So hopefully by the end of this final lesson here, you will be able to take everything that we've gone over in the past and then put it into practice and start taking beautiful pictures. So even though we're just going to be shooting one model today, we are going to be putting her in many different situations, and these techniques will apply to any type of photography that you're going to be doing if you're shooting another person or an individual subject, right? If you're shooting kids or a family or a wedding or a headshot or a portrait, all of the same lessons apply. So don't get hung up on the fact that you don't have a professional model to shoot. That does not matter. We're just using the model to put ourselves in situations where we have to be thinking, we have to be changing these settings, and we have to be using all the techniques that we've learned over this entire tutorial to create the best images possible. So this very first shot is actually going to take place right here on this couch. This is actually my office here in the F-Stoppers building, and it's not particularly exciting, it's not particularly pretty, and the lighting in here is actually really, really bad. At the moment, we have some video lights on me to make this look pretty decent, but we're gonna get Christy to swap places with me. She's gonna sit down here, and I'm going to show you what it actually looks like with these ugly fluorescent lights overhead, and then I'm going to work through a different way that we can light this shot, even with this horrible lighting in here, to create the best shot possible. Okay, so I have Christy sitting down here, and it's kind of bright and airy in here at the moment, but that is only because we have two video lights set up to make my interview look good. And of course, you guys shouldn't have video lights. This is an intro to photography class. And so to keep things fair, I'm going to cut these lights off and turn on the ugly overhead fluorescent lights first so you can see what it actually looks like in here. So now, as you can see, we flipped on only the fluorescent overhead lights. If you're watching this video here, you can probably see these weird lines going up and down throughout the video. Our white balance is also way off now. It's like yellow and green looking. Christy doesn't look particularly good with the direction of the light because it's coming from above her head and going straight down. It's creating bags under her eyes and nose and mouth. It's just not very flattering light on any level. So whether you're in an office building like we are right now with these fluorescent lights, or you're just in your house that happens to have incandescent lights, but maybe they're not placed in the most flattering position, you're going to have to work through that and come up with either a place to move the light, move your subject, or create your own light to get the best shot. But let's go ahead and start here just with the fluorescent lights on, and let's take a test shot and see what it looks like. Now, for this first shot here, I just guessed what my settings should be, and I was a little wrong. I went ahead and chose ISO 800 because it's a little dimly lit in here, and I chose my lowest aperture, which is 5.6 with this lens, that's as wide as the aperture goes, remember? And then for my shutter speed, I chose 1/60th of a second. I would not go any slower than that unless I had a tripod, and of course, I don't have a tripod right here. Now, being that it's still a little bit dark, let's go ahead and bump it up a bit more. I'm gonna change my ISO to ISO 1600, and we'll take that shot again. Now, as you can see, we have a correct exposure here. Christy looks all right, but you will notice, one, the white balance is a little weird. It's kind of like a greenish yellowish tint, and the camera is currently in auto white balance. It's trying its best to white balance it out, but it's struggling. We might be able to fix it a little bit more in post, but I just don't think that it's the color that I want to work with. Plus, the direction of the light, if you zoom in close, you can see it's creating these shadows that are coming down on her face. It's making her eye sockets, look really deep and sunken in. It's just not flattering light when you put the light directly over somebody's head. So let's go ahead first and just cut off all of the lights in here. I do not like the direction of these lights. I also don't like the color of these lights. And we will work with our own strobe light to make this picture. So as you can see, guys, there's only one window back here. It's not lighting me up enough. This is plenty of light for me to work in, but it's not enough light for me to teach a lesson in. So we're gonna flip the video lights back on here, but keep in mind that all of the pictures that I'm about to take and I'm about to show you were taken with all of the lights off. It's very dimly lit in here because all we want exposing our picture is strobe light for this shot. We don't want any other ambient light. So just keep in mind for the video lights are gonna be on, but they are not going to be on when I actually take the real pictures that you're seeing. All right, guys, while the lights were completely off, I went ahead and snapped a picture with the exact same camera settings that we had before. And as you can see, this shot is almost completely dark. So we're gonna have to bring in our own light here. I'm gonna start with the pop-up flash. And to pop up the flash, I'm just gonna hit the little flash button on my Nikon camera here. It's gonna pop up the flash, and the flash is automatically in a TTL or auto mode, right? So even though the camera is in manual, and I've manually chosen the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture, the camera will use the flash in auto mode to get a correct exposure for us, all right? Now, being that we're going to be using the strobe light, and this thing can produce a lot of light, we no longer need to be shooting at ISO 1600 because this thing can pump out so much light. We can lower our ISO and get a much cleaner looking shot. So I'm going to lower the ISO first of all to ISO 400. I think that's kind of a nice middle of the road area. If we went all the way down to ISO 100, the flash may be powerful enough to light her up, but when we start taking a lot of pictures, it's going to be firing so hard that it's not going to have enough time to recharge in between pictures, right? So ISO 400 is like a good middle ground. I'm going to keep the f-stop and the shutter speed the exact same, 5/6 and 1/60th of a second. So let's go ahead and take one shot here with the pop-up flash. Now, as you can see, we've got a correct exposure here, but it's kind of a flat, boring looking shot. You can see, you know, there's really no shadows on her face at all, but then we have that really small shadow underneath her chin that just kind of makes it look like cheap direct flash. It looks like a snapshot that anybody could take with a cell phone or a point and shoot camera. And of course, we spend a lot of money on these cameras. We don't want our pictures to look like snapshots, right? So what can we do to ramp up the production value here? Well, instead of using the pop-up flash, I'm going to use a speed light. So here I have an SB800. This would work fine. Also, one of the Yongnuo cheapo flashes from Amazon would work fine as well, but this is what we happen to have today. I'm gonna put this on, and this is in TTL mode. It's in the same auto mode that the pop-up flash was in. And I'm going to point this forward, and I'm going to take the exact same shot again and see if there's any differences. This looks so similar to the pop-up flash. The only difference that I can really see is the shadow under her chin with the larger speed light is a little bit thicker of a shadow. And that's because, of course, this light is raised up just a little bit higher. It's shooting down at her chin, and her chin is projecting a slightly larger shadow. So it would be a huge waste of money for you to go out and buy one of these speed lights and then point it at your subject just like this. It looks almost identical to the pop-up flash, right? We don't want to use the flash and make it look exactly like the one that's built into the camera. And what you're paying for when you buy one of these speed lights is the ability to bounce the light, right? So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to bounce the light straight up, and let's see what that shot looks like. So if you compare this to the direct flash, it looks very, very different. Now instead of that hard shadow under the chin, now we have much, much softer shadows. And that's of course because instead of having a really small light source directly lighting your subject, I'm lighting up the ceiling. The ceiling is a big white area, and then that is lighting up the subject. But you will notice that the angle of the shadows on her face, again, are very similar to the look when we had the fluorescent lights on. And that's because the light is coming from directly above her head and it's casting shadows down. So again, we have the sunken in eyes, we have the shadow under the chin. It just makes everything look kind of cheap. It doesn't look like a professional shot. So the next thing I'm going to do to try to make this picture look even better, I'm going to turn the flash around and fire it behind me. And what that's going to do, instead of lighting from above your subject and cast light down, it's going to light her from the front, and hopefully it will fill in her eyes. You'll be able to see a lot more detail in her eyes. It's going to make that shadow on her chin a lot smaller, but at the same time, the light is going to be super soft on her face as well. So let's check this out. Much better. I'm a big fan of the way this looks, and this is something that we can definitely use, but I want to try one more thing with the light here. I'm going to turn the speed light to the side, and I'm going to take a picture bouncing off of these cabinets over here to my left, and let's see what that looks like. Awesome. Now we have directional light coming from camera left. I think this is also something that we can really work with. So if you guys compare the two shots that we just took, lighting behind me and then lighting to the side of me, you'll notice that the pictures look pretty natural. It almost looks like she's just being lit by window light, and that's what I'm going for here. And keep in mind, window light is a large light source, usually coming from a wall somewhere. And that's kind of what we're recreating here when we light up a wall or light up a ceiling that's really far away. It's a large light source lighting up your subject, and it's a lot softer than a direct flash would be. So now that we have two lighting scenarios that I think are going to work well, let's work on the composition first of all. Now the first mistake that people are going to make is they are going to put their subject's head right in the middle of the frame, and this looks so cheap. So let me show you what people do every time. Because the focus point is right in the middle of the frame, they just think, oh, I'm just going to put it on their face and take the picture. And yes, her head is right in the middle of the frame, but notice all of the head space that we have over the top of her head. That's really weird. It feels like there should be something up there. It's just dead space. So remember, even though I'm keeping my focus point right in the middle of the frame, I'm going to focus on her, recompose, bring the camera down, bring her head to the top of the frame, then take the shot. Every single time, this is what I'm doing. Focusing, recomposing, shooting. Great. So now that you have a basic understanding of the composition that I'm going to go for, we're going to work through a few different poses here. I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to get closer. I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to zoom out. She's going to lean back, lean forward, lay to the side. We're just going to come up with a few different options, and I'm going to shoot through the entire time and show you what we come up with. So we ended up getting a ton of really great shots. You could see with some of these, I was bouncing light behind me, and you'll notice there's very even light on her face. And then for some of them, I was bouncing to my left or camera left, and you'll notice that there is light coming from the left side on some of these shots as well. Now, even though you just watched me do it and it was very bright in here, remember that we did that just for this lesson, just for the cameras, but these pictures that you're actually looking at that I took were taken with it very, very dark in here. All of the lights were turned off so that they weren't affecting my flashlight at all. My flash was the only light that was actually lighting her up for these shots. Now there's a few basic tips that you should take away from this shoot, guys. If you're shooting indoors, if you're going to be using the natural light that's in the house, keep in mind where it's coming from. Position your subject in an area where they actually are being hit by light in a flattering way. In our situation, there's no way that we could have moved Christy anywhere in here, so I just decided to turn the lights off. Now, when it comes to actual camera settings, because it was darker and dimmer even with the lights on earlier, I had to raise up my ISO. I was shooting at ISO 1600 when all the lights were on. Remember also that I don't want to go below 1/60th of a second with this lens if I'm hand holding the camera, so that's kind of locked in. So being that our shutter speed is going to be 1/60th and then our aperture is kind of locked in at 5.6, it kind of determines our ISO for us. We had to choose ISO 1600. We had to go up to it with all of the lights on to get a correct exposure. But once we turn the strobe light on, we have a lot more light to play with because these things are so bright. So what we were able to do is lower the ISO back down to ISO 400, which will create a cleaner image for us. I shot all of these pictures in auto white balance, but keep in mind I'm also shooting in RAW, so if you want to fix the white balance afterwards, we easily can in post. Now, if you compare the first snapshot that we took with the pop-up flash to one of our final shots where we were bouncing the speed light off of the wall or back on the ceiling behind me, you can see it's night and day. We took a snapshot to a professional looking image with almost no work at all. But of course we're inside. This was a pretty simple shoot. So let's head outside now and ramp things up a little bit. All right, guys, we are currently out here in very harsh light, as you can see, and we're in a popular park here in Charleston because I want to show you some situations where an amateur photographer will go directly towards certain specific shots every time they're in a space like this. And then I want to kind of point you into the other direction, a direction that a professional photographer would take. So we're standing out here in very harsh, bright, hot sunlight because the water behind us here is a shot that everybody who's visiting Charleston wants to get. They want to pose people right here in front of this wall, and then they want to take a picture and go, look, we were in Charleston and look at the pretty water behind everyone. And that's fine. If you want to document a time, if you want to show, hey, my family was here on this year and we went on vacation, that's totally fine. Take all the snapshots like this that you want. But if you're trying to become a professional photographer, you want your pictures to look like the pictures you see in magazines and stuff, you're not going to take a picture this way. But just to prove it to you, let's go ahead and take a quick shot of Christy here, and I'll show you what it looks like. So as you can see, guys, she's having a hard time keeping her eyes open, but in all honesty, because it's so late in the day and the sun is so relatively low, it's not that unflattering of a position. It's just super, super harsh, right? So as I'm taking these shots here, she's trying not to squint. These pictures aren't horrible. It's certainly better than if the light was behind her and the sky was totally blown out. We have detail in the shot. So even though this picture's not horrible with a professional model, if you can imagine if you were shooting like a family portrait or something and you're trying to have 10 people line up against this fist and everybody's trying not to squint or blink, it's gonna be very, very difficult to pull this off. And that's the reason why I just don't really like lighting with the sun directly in people's faces, even though this is the perfect position for the sun to light directly. It's just too bright and too harsh. But instead of going directly to the shady spot that I personally choose when I come to this park, let's go to one more stereotypical spot. You can probably hear there's a fountain right behind me over here. Every single person that comes to this park likes getting their picture taken in front of this fountain. Let's try that next. So behind me here is Charleston's famous pineapple fountain. This thing gets photographed so many times. There's kids playing in it. There's always people walking around it. And every single tourist that comes over here has to take a picture in front of it. I come to this park all the time to shoot my clients, and I never once have taken a single picture in front of this fountain. And here's a good example why. You can see the sun's over my left shoulder right now, and it's coming across both of our faces. Even though the sun is low enough to be flattering coming straight on your subject, side light like this does not look flattering. It's still very difficult for me to keep my eyes open, so I'm squinting a lot, but then it's also creating these long shadows across both of our faces. Let me go ahead and take a few shots and show you what they look like. So as you can see, guys, these shots are looking much worse than the previous shot. Yes, we could move her around the fountain and get better looking light, but this is the direction that most people want to shoot this fountain in. And it's fine if you want to document that you were here in front of this fountain, but in terms of taking a good looking picture, you're not going to pull it off shooting from this direction at this time of day. It just looks cheap and cheesy. So what I tend to go towards is shade when I'm out here. I like working in shade and working off the bounce light that's coming from the sky and different structures around here, like the previous lesson that I taught. So let's go out here to this field, which is a nice shady field, and I'm going to show you a few other mistakes that I see a lot of photographers making. I've just moved a few feet over to the side here. We're in this open field area, and of course we're in open shade. It's much easier to keep our eyes open. It's much more comfortable to do the photo shoot, but you'll see that there's another problem here, because when I'm shooting in this direction, again, with the water in the background like our very first shot, there's a huge difference in exposures on my foreground, which is Christy, and then my background, which is the sky and the water, which is directly lit by the sun. So what I'm going to do first, I'm just gonna put the camera in P mode to show you what the camera thinks we should do here. This is just an example. This is not what I would normally do. I'm gonna take this shot. 3, 2, 1. And as you can see, I cannot see Christy at all in this picture. She just goes completely black, and the camera thinks, hey, I should just expose for that really bright background. And of course, we have tons of detail in the background and none on the subject herself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back into manual, and let's expose for our model here. So what I'm going to do first is change my ISO. I'll set it to ISO 400 just because we're in the shade. F5 because I want the background to be a little bit blurry. And then I'm just gonna mess with my shutter speed to get a correct exposure on her. if the camera, when I look at the meter here, it's telling me that 1/1000th of a second is a correct exposure. But I know, because I just took a picture in P mode, that's way underexposed. The camera's very wrong on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower my shutter speed a lot here. I'm gonna go from 1/1000th of a second, let's go down to 2/50th of a second. I'm just gonna take a shot, I'm just guessing here. And there we go, that's actually a pretty good exposure on Christy. And you can see she looks nice. The lighting on her actually looks really, really nice. I love that side lighting kind of coming in off the water. I think she looks great, but the background is absolutely destroyed. There's no detail back there. There's so much blown out white. This shot will not work. Now, of course, if you were good enough in Photoshop, you could cut her out and put her on another background and it would look awesome, but we don't have the time to do that, and I imagine you don't want to deal with your photography like that either. So what are we going to do? We need to find an area of shade where the foreground, our subject, is lit very similarly to the background. And I know, because I'm here all the time, that right over here to my right, there's this little pathway in between trees, and I can shoot down this pathway and get a very even exposure on my foreground and background. So let's head over there next, and I'll show you how I work through that shot. So we've moved a few yards now, and we are down this really beautiful path with these oak trees kind of covering us the entire way. And you can already tell just by looking at this video how we have an even exposure in the foreground. The subject matter, us, we are evenly lit with the background. It's just a well-balanced image. So now that we're in a good area, I think this is really going to work. Let me start shooting, and I'll kind of tell you my thought process as I'm shooting, and we will work through the best image that we can possibly make. So I'm still shooting on the 18 to 55 millimeter lens, and I'm noticing this lens, if I want to get a full body shot here, it's just too wide. You can actually see a trash can and a recycle bin on the left side of the frame on each of these pictures. And also, what's taking up the majority of this picture, besides Christy, is this huge pathway. It just is engulfing the whole picture, when really the coolest part of the picture is the trees and the leaves and the light coming through the trees. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on my 70 to 300 millimeter lens. I'm gonna back up a little bit and zoom in. And what that's going to do, if you remember, is compress the background. That's what we call it. It's gonna make that background suck up behind her. We're gonna see a lot more of the trees and the leaves and way less of the ground. And of course, we're also going to lose the trash cans completely. So as you can see, guys, I have backed up a lot here, and I still haven't zoomed in that much. I'm shooting at about 135 millimeters here with this lens. As you can see, there's a ton of people back there. We're just kind of waiting for them to clear out. But the basic idea is that I can back up to this point, zoom back into the exact same composition that we were shooting at before, but now I can completely crop out those trash cans and I can get a lot more of the background. One issue that I'm still having, though, is that I'm seeing a bunch of the ground and not that much of the trees. And the cool thing about backing up and zooming in is I can really pinpoint exactly what my background's going to be by just moving a little bit. So what I'm going to do, instead of standing up, obviously I'm a little bit taller than Christy here and I'm kind of shooting down on her, and that's why I'm getting all the ground. I'm going to sit on the ground, shoot up at her, lose a lot of the ground, but gain a lot of the trees in the background. I think it's really gonna make this image look a lot better. 3, 2, 1. So now I really feel like this image is starting to come together. We've had good light on Christy for a while now with the last few shots that we've done, but now we finally have a balanced image where there's great light on her and there's even light on the background as well. And by sitting down, I've completely changed the look of this shot, and now we have all these beautiful oak trees in the image. There's one more thing that I think we can do to really make this image pop. If you can look right behind Christy, there are these light rays coming through the trees and hitting the ground back there. And I love using those to my advantage. What I'm going to do is ask Christy just to take a few steps back until the light starts to hit her in the hair, the shoulder and everything. And I'm going to use the sun as a natural hair light. And what this is going to do is really make her pop off of that dark background. And I think it's really gonna make this image come alive. It's gonna give it the final touch to make it look like a professional looking shot. So Christy, go ahead and take a few steps back for me. And you can look at the light change on her as she moves around here. That's perfect. Great. Let's do a few test shots right here. I love the look of that highlight on her hair. It looks awesome. And watch your nose. You can see if she turns her nose a little bit too much towards that sun, it's starting to hit her in the face. I don't want to see that. So I can either tell her to look a little bit more back towards me, or I can tell her to take a step forward or backward, and it's going to change the way the light hits her face. These look great. We do have a few people in the background, but it's fine. I'm just going to shoot through it for now, just for these example shots. And what's so awesome about shooting in shade like this is she can look in almost any direction and the pictures look awesome. Because we're in this open shade, we're using the sunlight behind her as that natural hair light. It looks like we have 2 or 3 lights on her in the studio, but it's all natural light. So in some of the previous shots, I didn't really go over my settings because I knew those shots were bad and it wasn't worth wasting the time. But now that we've gotten this shot locked in, I want to tell you quickly how I came to the decision for each of my settings. Now, I like to have that shallow depth of field, and this lens allows me to go to 5.6, similar to the other one, and so I wanted my aperture to be as wide as possible, so I set it to 5.6. Now, because I'm zooming in so much with this lens and I'm hand holding it, I knew that I needed a little bit faster shutter speed than I normally would. So I set my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second, and then from there, the only thing you have left to do is change your ISO. So all I did was I kept changing my ISO and then checking my light meter until I got that light meter to go right in the middle. The camera, of course, is choosing the correct exposure right now because this image is so balanced. And I ended up falling on 1600 ISO, which is a pretty high ISO considering that it's outside and it's daylight right now. But it's just so dark in these trees right here. And because I need my shutter speed to be so fast, because this is a long lens, I don't want to get that camera shake. It was our only option for this image. Now, when it comes to our white balance, I'm still shooting in auto white balance, and it's doing a pretty good job here. I know that I'm going to be shooting in RAW and I'm going to be editing these pictures in post, so I'm not really worried about my white balance for these shots right now. So keep in mind, if you're shooting JPEG, you may want to pick one of the more manual white balance settings just to dial it in perfectly. But for me, I'm shooting RAW. I know I'm going to have the power to change it in post, so I'm leaving it in auto. So now that we have everything locked in, she's looking great. I'm just gonna wait for the crowd to pass here. I am going to do a few different shots. I'm gonna do some verticals, some horizontals, and see what we can come up with. We are now in this incredible alleyway here in downtown Charleston, and we're gonna use some of the same techniques that we just did on the last shot in this shot, but we're gonna ramp things up a little bit. I'm still going to be using the 70 to 300 millimeter lens, so I'm going to be backing up and zooming in a lot to shoot Christy here. But I'm going to get her to walk and spin and play with her dress a little bit so that we can freeze the action and get a little bit more mood and emotion in these shots. Now, the first thing that I'm going to have to deal with here is my shutter speed. Because she's going to be moving around, she's going to be walking towards the camera, she's going to be flipping her dress. I want to freeze that action. I don't want to see any sort of motion blur. So I'm going to have to use a faster shutter speed. Remember in the last shot, I was shooting at 1/200th of a second. For this shot, I'm going to go all the way up to 1/500th of a second. And one of the issues that we've found here is it's a little dark, kind of like it was in the shade in the last one, but because we're raising up our shutter speed, remember we're losing a bunch of light, and therefore we have to bump up our ISO even more. So for this shot, I am actually shooting at ISO 6400, and I can't believe I'm shooting at such a high ISO when it's still daylight out here, just because it's so dim and I'm having to shoot it at f5.6. It's our only option. Now, the other thing that I have to deal with here is the focusing itself. With the other few shots that we've taken, I've just been in single point right in the middle of the frame and it's locked on and taken the picture. But for this, I want to shoot a lot of pictures quickly to get all that motion. So what I'm going to do first of all is hit the Q button on the back of the camera, change the focus mode to AI servo. Remember, that's going to focus all the way through the shots. Then I'm going to hit the drive mode button on the back of the camera, and I am going to choose continuous shooting here. And continuous shooting allows me to press the button down, and it's going to just take pictures rapidly as she walks towards the camera. So let's go ahead and take these shots. All right, Christy, start walking this way. Give me a little speed and emotion. Great, you can give me a spin right there. Awesome. And remember, the camera is focusing all the way through as it continues to shoot when it's in this mode. I can also hold the button down. It's just gonna snap, 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 snap all the way through the frame. I think we got some good shots, but let's try it one more time. We're at our final location here, which is this amazing marina behind me, and over my left shoulder, the sun is just about to set. Now, we would have set up with the sun behind us so that you could see the sunset, but you're going to see the problem in just 1 second. When you set your model up and you're looking into the sun, even if it's during the sunset when the sky's a little bit more evenly lit, your subject is going to go completely black. And we're gonna have to come up with a way to actually get her to stand out and get the background in the exact same shot. So let's go over here, we'll try it out, and I will work through this with you on camera. The very first thing that I'm going to do is get a correct exposure on this background. I'm not even gonna worry about Christy with this first shot. So I'm just gonna hold the camera up to my eye, press the shutter button down halfway, and with my previous settings, it is saying I am way overexposed. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my ISO to the lowest setting, which is 100 on this camera. Now, I know that I'm going to be adding strobe to this later on, and I know my highest sync speed is 1/160th of a second. So I'm just gonna go ahead and set that as my highest sync speed, and I'm gonna lock that in, remember 1/160th. And then to get a correct exposure, I'm just going to play with my f-stop. And so I'm gonna hold down this button to change my f-stop, rotate this knob here, and I'm gonna keep rotating it until I get a correct exposure. This is telling me 7.1 as my aperture's correct exposure. Let's go ahead and take this shot. All right, as you can see, we've got a correct exposure on the background. That looks really nice with the sun back there, but we can't see Christy at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna have David come over here and I'm going to see if I can get a correct exposure using a reflector to reflect some of that sunlight back on Christy. So we just have a giant silver reflector here. David's just gonna hold it over his head. David, see if you can get any light to come on her at all. I'm not seeing much of any difference at all. And that's because the sun is so low at this point and the sky's kind of evenly lit. It's really not doing anything, but let's do a test shot and just see. All right, there's almost no difference at all. So what we're going to have to do here is add strobe light. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my speed light and I'm just going to do a direct flash. So I've got my speed light on here. I am going to set this to manual because this is actually a Nikon speed light on a Canon body here. So I'm just gonna manually control it. I am just going to guess and choose 1/16th power. And let's take a test shot here. So you can see that we now have a correct exposure on her. She looks pretty good. The background is balanced with her. Our color, our white balance is a little bit off, but that's nothing that we can't fix in post if we need to. But my biggest issue with this is having the nice soft looking background and then the super harsh strobe light coming from the front. I think it looks kind of cheap. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use the reflector once more and I'm going to reflect off of the reflector with my strobe light, very similar to the very first shot that we did with Christy. Instead of using the wall though, I'm gonna use this reflector. Come on in here, David. And I know because I'm bouncing this, I'm gonna need a lot more power. I'm just gonna guess once again, I need to go up to 1/2 power. And let's see if I can do this. I'm gonna point it at the reflector here and let's take a shot. It's a little dark. Let me just go ahead and bump it up just a little bit. I'm gonna go to full power now. This is very bright, but remember we're bouncing, so we're gonna be losing a lot of light. And I think this looks awesome. So this is a really good example of how you can still use bounce flash outside, but keep in mind you're going to have something to bounce off of. In this case, we don't have a building around us, so we do have David with this reflector. But you could also use a white building or a car to bounce some light so that you're not getting that really harsh direct light. Now, if you don't happen to have a speed light and you don't happen to have an assistant with a reflector, you just may not want to shoot directly into the sun, into that sunset. Instead, what you could do is just spin around and shoot the other way. And so even though it doesn't really look like sunset, you're not going to see all of the colors, this direction of the sky is really beautiful as well. So the sun has now set. I'm just gonna walk over here with Christy. I'm gonna take a few natural light shots just to show you that you can get beautiful shots without strobe light as well, and then we'll wrap up here. So at this point, we've completely lost our sun, but I'm shooting in the other direction. And even though the sun is below the horizon at this point, that side of the sky is still a little bit brighter. So it's nice to use that as a key light on our subject. I'm shooting towards these beautiful blue and purple skies that we have back here. Each one of these shots that I'm taking looks awesome, completely naturally lit. Even though I have the speed light on the camera here, it's not on, so I'm not using this at all. So many photographers think that as soon as the sun goes down, the photo shoot's over, right? No more sun, no more light. That's not true at all. I love shooting once the sun goes down. It's basically like we have shade everywhere we go. I can shoot in almost any direction right over this way, and she's going to look awesome. And I also have detail in the background. That's very, very rare. It only happens before the sun comes up and right after it goes down. So we have about 20 minutes after the sun goes down to get the most beautiful shots of the entire day. I absolutely love shooting at this time. And what's so cool too is we have the ability to zoom in, get great portraits right now. I can also zoom out, show all the detail in the cattails here, the water, the sky. Every single picture that I'm taking looks totally awesome and it's totally naturally lit. So I hope all of these shoots that we've done have helped you learn that you can get great looking images no matter how inexpensive your camera gear is. And all of the stuff that we've been teaching you throughout this tutorial can actually come together to create some pretty stunning looking pictures. My goal for this tutorial is to make sure that you take control of your camera. We don't want your camera in any sort of auto mode so that it's deciding what the picture should look like. You need to take control of your camera, the camera settings, and your subject. If the lighting looks bad on your subject, do something about it. Either add light with a speed light or just move them like we have right here and shoot in the opposite direction so that you get that beautiful looking light on your subject. At the end of the day, so many people believe that it's all about the camera and an expensive professional camera takes expensive looking pictures, and that is not true at all. We have taken tons of great looking pictures today with pretty much the cheapest cameras you can possibly buy that are still DSLRs. And hopefully, if you guys have watched this tutorial, you will get out of those auto modes and you will start to take control and take awesome looking shots.